Right now, you're probably not thinking about privacy, but the moment someone looks at your phone without asking, walks into your bedroom without knocking, or stands too close to you on the subway, something in you bristles. Privacy feels like a basic human need, as essential as food or shelter. We build walls, we lock doors, we pay extra for hotel rooms without windows facing other windows. We are obsessed with it, but here's the thing. For almost all of human history, privacy didn't exist. Or at least, not the way we think about it. Your ancestors didn't have bedroom doors. They didn't have locks. For hundreds of thousands of years, people lived in groups where everyone saw everything. Everyone knew everything. There was no private space, no private moment, and no expectation of ever having one. So the question becomes simple but strange. How did humans survive that? How did your ancestors maintain sanity, relationships, and a sense of self when they literally never got to be alone? And maybe more importantly, what did privacy actually mean to them? Because the answer changes everything we think we know about human psychology, community, and why you're so desperate to be by yourself right now. For a long time, researchers assumed ancient humans didn't care about privacy. They thought early people were so focused on survival that concepts like personal space or solitude were luxuries nobody had time for. It seemed obvious. Hunt, gather, stay warm, reproduce, die. Privacy would be somewhere at the bottom of that list, if it made the list at all. But that assumption was built on modern people studying ancient people. We projected our needs backward. We assumed that because we crave privacy, because we feel violated when it's violated, that this was something humans always wanted. In 2019, archaeologist Anne Pike from the University of the Witwatersrand spent a year studying privacy practices across remaining hunter-gatherer societies. What she found was striking. These groups weren't ignoring privacy. They were solving it in ways we completely missed. They had codes, unspoken rules, spatial arrangements that meant something, rituals that created privacy without walls, without locks, without anything we would recognize as an actual barrier. The privacy they had wasn't the privacy of walls. It was the privacy of understanding. Let's start with the obvious one: shelter design. When you look at archaeological evidence of ancient human dwellings, something stands out immediately. They're small, incredibly small. A typical shelter from 20,000 years ago in Europe, one of those mammoth bone structures we talked about before, was maybe 15 feet across. Everyone lived in there. Parents, children, elderly, sometimes even visitors. You could reach across the entire space and touch the opposite wall. So how did anyone get privacy in 15 square feet with 10 other people? They didn't. Not physical privacy anyway. Not in the way you understand it. But archaeologists have found something interesting. In sites across Europe and Asia, there are patterns in how people arrange themselves. In caves in France dating back 30,000 years, researchers found evidence of internal walls made from stones and bones, creating distinct zones within larger spaces, not complete partitions, more like suggestions, screens. A mother with a nursing infant might position herself behind a mammoth tusk, leaned against the wall. It wasn't a locked door, but it was a signal, a visual boundary that said, "I'm over here, I need space right now." The real privacy came from another direction entirely: darkness. In a shelter lit only by fire, you could create privacy by positioning yourself just outside the reach of the flames. You'd still hear everything, but you wouldn't be seen. And the psychological difference between being seen and not being seen is enormous. A woman going through her menstrual cycle didn't need a separate room. She needed to sit at the edge of the firelight, slightly apart, and that was enough. This pattern shows up across cultures and across thousands of years. The Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last groups living close to a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, still use this system. In their camps, there are no private structures. just huts arranged in a circle around a central fire. But they have spatial privacy. People position themselves on the perimeter for intimate moments. They turn their backs. They lower their voices. And crucially, everyone else respects that signal. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because physical privacy was only half the equation, the other half was social privacy. Rules so ingrained that they didn't need to be explained. Everyone just knew them. Anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who studied what humans talk about when they're not talking about survival, discovered something in modern hunter-gatherer groups that probably applied to ancient ones too. There are things you don't talk about, periods of time when you don't ask questions, moments when you actively pretend not to notice something. If someone walked off into the bush alone, you didn't ask why. You didn't follow. You didn't discuss it when they came back. There was an understanding that they were doing something private, and that was sacred. Biological functions, intimate moments, grief, whatever it was, everyone had an unspoken agreement to look away. This is actually harder than it sounds. In a group of 20 people in a small space, you can't actually leave someone alone. You can see them, you can hear them. The only way to give someone privacy is to collectively agree to pretend they're not there, to not see, to not hear, to not remember. And your ancestors were very, very good at this. Indigenous Australian peoples, who maintained some of the most ancient human traditions, formalized this into law. There were spaces you didn't go, times you didn't ask questions, certain family members you didn't speak to directly. These rules created invisible privacy boundaries using nothing but social agreement. You couldn't be physically alone, but you could be socially alone. And your mind doesn't always know the difference. But there's one area where privacy took on urgent, practical importance, and that's reproduction and the female body. In archaeological sites across Europe and Africa, researchers have found evidence of menstrual huts or separate spaces designated for women during menstruation. Now, a lot of modern interpretation of this has been colored by Western ideas about unclean or impure. But that's probably reading our assumptions into their culture. A more likely explanation is simpler. A woman menstruating needs privacy for practical reasons. It's uncomfortable. It's bloody. It requires space and time to manage. In a small communal shelter, that's a problem nobody else wants to deal with. So communities created a solution. A separate structure where a woman could go for a few days, and importantly, where she could do what she needed to do without an audience. This wasn't punishment. It was privacy. And for someone who never otherwise got it, it might have actually been a relief. Time alone. Time away from the group dynamics. Time to rest without someone needing something from you. Birth was the same way. In nearly every culture, ancient and modern, childbirth happens with other women present, but men excluded. Privacy isn't isolation. It's controlling who gets to witness something vulnerable. It's about dignity. But here's what we don't usually talk about. Constant visibility has a cost. A real psychological cost. In 2015, researchers at the University of Michigan studied what happens to people when they never get to be alone. They looked at refugee camps, dense urban slums, and multi-generational housing situations. Basically, places where privacy is nearly impossible. What they found was a consistent pattern: increased stress, higher rates of anxiety, more aggressive behavior. People have a breaking point. Your ancestors must have hit that point regularly. Imagine 10 people in a 15-foot space for weeks during a harsh winter. Everyone sick, everyone stressed, everyone watching everyone else. The psychological pressure would be immense. But they had something we don't think about much. They had ritual, they had ceremony, they had ways of marking time that created psychological privacy. Even when physical privacy was impossible, seasonal movements helped. When a band split up to hunt or forage separately for parts of the year, you got relief. You saw different people. You had distance. The rhythm of the seasons meant that the intensive communal period didn't last forever. They also had storytelling. When you're sitting around the fire, listening to a myth about the creation of the world, you're not noticing that the person next to you smells bad or that someone's cough is driving you crazy. You're transported somewhere else mentally. That's privacy of a kind. Privacy of attention. Privacy of mind. And they had altered states. Meditation, trance, dancing, rhythm. These are tools for stepping outside your immediate reality. An anthropologist studying the San people of Southern Africa noted that certain rituals seemed designed purely to create a state of mind where nothing else existed except that moment. A kind of meditation in the middle of a crowd, alone together. So when did privacy become what it is today? When did it transform from a social agreement to look away into the legal right to be alone? The answer is agriculture. And it's not what you'd expect. When people stopped moving and started staying in one place, something shifted. You couldn't escape difficult people by moving to a new territory. You couldn't relieve tension by splitting from the group seasonally. You were stuck. And suddenly, privacy wasn't a nice to have. It was a necessity. By 10,000 years ago, as humans settled into villages, we see the first evidence of structures with separate rooms, multiple compartments within single dwellings. By the time we get to classical civilizations, privacy is becoming formalized. The Romans had a concept of privacy called privatio, literally meaning a space set apart. By medieval times in Europe, the wealthy were beginning to build private chambers. By the Victorian era, privacy had become a moral value. By the modern era, it's a right. But here's the catch. Your brain didn't evolve for the privacy you have now. It evolved for something much different. When anthropologists study modern people who are forced to live with constant visibility, prisoners, patients in hospitals, people in care facilities, something interesting happens. They don't adapt. They get stressed, anxious, depressed. Humans hate constant surveillance. But here's the paradox. Modern humans also get lonely in ways that ancient humans probably didn't. You can have a locked door, a private bedroom, complete solitude, and still feel profoundly isolated. Because privacy and isolation aren't the same thing. Your ancestors lived with constant visibility, but strong social bonds. They couldn't be alone, but they were never truly lonely. You can be alone whenever you want, but you're often lonely anyway. You have physical privacy, but social isolation. The privacy they had was built on understanding, a collective agreement that you were worth protecting, that your dignity mattered even if your body was visible, that there were things you didn't need to explain or justify. You turned that into walls and locks and passwords and the right to be left alone. And maybe that's necessary. Maybe you can't have deep civilization without privacy. Maybe creativity and thought require solitude. Maybe the alone time you crave is real and valid and worth whatever we've sacrificed for it. But sometimes, when you're sitting in your private room with the door locked, checking your phone, making sure nobody's watching, you might wonder what your ancestors would think. These people who never had a moment to themselves, who lived their entire lives in a crowd, who created privacy with nothing but an agreement to look away. They might think you'd solved the wrong problem.